Right. Welcome everyone to another Rev War Roundtable with Emerging Rev War. This is Rev War Revelry. We're back in the Revolutionary War this week after taking a sojourn back last week into the French and Indian War. So today we are joined by two esteemed members, besides always the great and esteemed Mark Malloy. To my top left, I'll introduce the lady first. That is Kate Gruber, the Special Collections Curator for the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. And when it does open back up, please visit some of our handiwork at the American Revolutionary War Museum in Yorktown. To my bottom left, who is going to hit his reputation, hit a little bit by joining this ERW group. That is Kirby. Kirby Smith is formerly of Colonial National Historical Park. He's a 16-year veteran of the United States Army, native of the Yorktown area, and he's currently working for the Department of Defense. But he's also one of the leading experts on the Battle of Green Spring, which is summer of 1781, but is pivotal in the build-up to what would be the campaign and siege that happens in October. So thank you everyone for joining us. As we kick off this last Zoom in May, so whether May went by quick or slow for you, we are here at the end of the month. So where should we start? Should we start with Green Spring? Does that sound like a good place to spring off from, as I use a play on words there? Yeah, Kirby, you want to lead us into Green Spring? Talk a little bit about what it is, where it is, if it's important.
It's always important. I'm fortunate to live within walking distance of the battlefield, which for those of you that aren't familiar with it is actually just down the road from the Jamestown settlement, which is part of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation property. It's a battle that is often overlooked by most historians just because it sort of ends in a draw, depending on which standpoint you look at it from. But the interesting thing about the battle itself is the fact that it's the largest open field battle during the American Revolution in the state of Virginia. So we look at the Siege of Yorktown, which we'll talk about here in a little while, but as far as open field fight, where there's no earthworks, there's no siege works, just a force on force, duking it out battle, something that you would think of as kind of the quintessential action of the American Revolution. The largest action like that takes place at Green Spring. Now, depending on who you talk to, some people think that it was a small action, some people think that it was a large action, but I think it could have had a fairly significant impact on the way that things proceeded by the time September and October roll around later that year. So Green Spring itself, the battle takes place on July 6, 1781. And this is the first meeting of General Lafayette and General Cornwallis in an open field like this.
So you have the luminaries there, Lafayette, Wayne, Cornwallis. What happens then? Does Cornwallis turn toward Yorktown? Is that his direction, or are we still not quite there yet?
We're not quite there yet. So by July 6th, we've got a number of orders that are coming down from New York City with General Clinton asking for support from Cornwallis. Cornwallis has roughly a quarter to a third of the British forces in North America, or Crown forces at this point, including the German regiments. But Clinton's looking at Washington's army, which is laying outside of New York City. And his greatest fear, obviously, is that New York City will come under siege and he'll be stuck there. So he reaches out to Cornwallis, and Cornwallis is getting conflicting messages. And eventually the message comes down for Cornwallis to provide some additional forces. He's looking at about a third to maybe half of the forces that he has here in Virginia, which is roughly about 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers at that point. And throughout the month of June, they're maneuvering between Richmond, Williamsburg, places in between. You've got Tarleton, and some of his forces go as far as Charlottesville, chasing Jefferson at one point. So they've been all over Virginia by the time early July rolls around. They make their way to Williamsburg, and they'll be in Williamsburg with Cornwallis and his force from June 25th until about July 4th. So they remain there for the July 4th period, and then that evening the first forces leave Williamsburg to make their way down the Jamestown Road to the south towards Jamestown Island. Jamestown Island is the crossing point on the James River by this point in the war that both sides are using fairly frequently. There's a ferry that runs from Jamestown Island to a small town on the other side called Cobham. Cobham's no longer in existence, but it's over on the Surrey side, the south side of the river. But Cornwallis is getting orders to move down to Portsmouth, and Portsmouth at this point is the major seaport for the British forces in Virginia. So he's making his way down there, following guidance from Clinton, trying to get his force down there consolidated, move away from the small mixed continental Virginia militia force under Lafayette, and get those men on ships and meet that timely demand that Clinton needs those forces as soon as possible.
We have them marching, of course, on to the Peninsula. So does anyone want to pick up any interesting tidbits from there?
I think that the Green Spring is also, I think it's like one of the most dramatic, as Kirby was talking about, the largest open field battle. But there's an amazing part during the battle where Anthony Wayne's men come up and they march right into the British regulars, and Kirby actually gave a wonderful tour of the actual battlefield a few years ago, and it's actually really close to where Kate works, near where the Jamestown settlement is, museum, and the battlefield. Pretty neat to, if anybody gets a chance to go down there and check it out. It's very cool, but they did some archaeology and were able to find that the British and the American lines at one point were, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's like 30 paces away from each other, that they were actually like firing into each other. So the British and the American lines closed in extremely close, and the firefight was pretty intense from everything I've read about the battle. So, and I think one of the descriptions of Anthony Wayne's men marching right into it was madness, and the fact that they marched right into this British force and almost a fearless maneuver. So I think it definitely shows how the American fighting forces had evolved from the beginnings of to by 1781, where somebody to actually be they were worth something by 1781 for sure.
Mark, just to pick up on what you just said, and this is, unless I'm mistaken, this Green Springs was largely a trap that Cornwallis was attempting to set for Lafayette and for Wayne. And the thing that I find really, really interesting about this battle is that we are not that far removed from when the entire PA line has mutinied under Wayne. And so for the fact that, these guys have just, have just marched from Philly, and, this is kind of their, their first major action really in the Southern campaign after half their line has just mutinied, is just, or they're down to half their line after this major mutiny. I find that fascinating. And these are the guys that that are going to be the first ones to engage Cornwallis here in the South. I just find that, or in Virginia rather, I just find that really fascinating.
So do you know any reason why that the Pennsylvania line is sent? Just throwing it out there, things that if they're just recently removed from a mutiny, is that because the Virginia Continental Line has been destroyed at Camden and has been recruited? Are they the best that Washington's got to supply Lafayette with, or is it just because Wayne is strong enough character to hold them together?
I think yes is the answer to your question.
I'm not trying to, I know hard questions here. I'm just trying to.
What I think is really cool too is and nearby the battlefield, there's a tomb of a unknown soldier that was found on the battlefield and that was killed during the battle. And they actually did, I think, DNA testing on the bones, and they were able to determine that he came from the region. It was likely he was one of the Pennsylvanians, which is, from a scientific standpoint, pretty amazing. You can be able to do that. And they have a very nice little park there and an inscription. I forget the name of there's a church right there.
Church on the Main.
Church on the Main.
And every Memorial Day, there's a group that will go and have a small service and lay a wreath on the Tomb of the Unknown Revolutionary Soldier.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's one of those kind of like off the beaten path, but if you're ever down in the Williamsburg area, I would definitely, you're going to be hitting Jamestown Settlement already or whatever, definitely pull off and take a look at both the battlefield, what's there today, and then also the church on the main, and check out that grave.
Well, I'm glad we started the discussion with Green Spring, and there's Spencer's Ordinary too. But just from my perspective, working for the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, and so much of what we do obviously is wrapped up in the siege at Yorktown. But there's so much that has to happen, and so many culminating forces that come together to get us to the Yorktown Campaign, to get Cornwallis entrenched in Yorktown, to finally convince Washington that he doesn't want to attack at New York. He really wants to go and engage in Virginia. There's so much that has to happen, and I think that people seem to or tend to take Yorktown as just take it for granted, as that's just how it all played out. But there are so many little things that had to come together, so many puzzle pieces to get everyone in that moment. And Green Springs is exactly the real start of that. As Kirby mentioned with Cornwallis, trying to use these routes to get his troops back to Portsmouth so that he can try to figure out what Clinton is thinking, which Clinton wouldn't be calling for reinforcements if he thought that Washington wasn't going to go attack in New York. So many little things have to happen to culminate at Yorktown, and it was never it was never a predetermined, I guess is what I'm trying to say, it was never a predetermined outcome for either side.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
well, I think that, you touched on it, Kate, too. The decision even to move to Yorktown in the summer of 1781, I think, is one of the biggest, most important decisions of the entire war. And I don't think people realize how much Washington actually wanted to take New York. And when you read through the history, it's very clear, after basically losing New York in such an embarrassing way in 1776, and then I think it was personal for him. I think he really wanted to take New York, and so it's really interesting how things play out. And then once the French arrived, and Rochambeau and his army, and trying to get Washington, I think it's one of Washington's greatest moments, is to basically take his ego out of it, and say, and defer basically to what Rochambeau and all his top advisors are telling him, and that's get Cornwallis. He's isolated down in Yorktown, and we can get the French fleet, and we can trap him. This is the plan you want to do. I think many other military commanders would say, no, we're doing it my way. So I think it's kind of amazing Washington did that.
Yeah, and that's something that I wish more people knew about how we get to Yorktown, is Washington has to majorly acquiesce to Rochambeau, and basically says, just fine. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, Rochambeau has already put so many of these pieces in place already, and it is a testament to, I think a lot of people say that Washington was a pretty crappy military strategist, but just a really great leader. And I think that really falls into it, that he is able to acquiesce to Rochambeau and finally sees, okay, this is the strategy. And as you say, Mark, take ego out of it and see that that's the better plan.
One thing we take for granted too is, and Kate made a good point, we always look at it like it's a fait accompli, like it's over, it's going to win.
That's the word I was looking for.
The logistics side of it. Kirby has been in the military for years. I grew up on military bases. My father worked in logistics. We're trying to run stuff to places like Bosnia and everything else. And it was easy with phone calls and the emails and the internet. But here's, you're shuttling troops there. You're converging troops to different places. You're also hoping to connect with the French Navy that's coming up from the Caribbean or so forth into a port like that. You're trying to get all these pieces together and also keep Clinton in the dark. So you got to keep troops there in New York, but also along the route, hopefully no one races ahead of you to warn, because there's loyalists along the way, there's desertions along the way. And one of the amazing things too, and actually a shout out to the Grubers there, is that last time I was in the historic triangle, they actually took me out to one of the road traces that is original coming out, where some of the troops landed and so forth. So it's amazing. that the road probably hasn't improved much, although I think there was a Target there. So he might have stopped on the way, pick up supplies at Target, and then head into Yorktown itself.
And a JCPenney too.
JCPenney. So, I mean, the one looked good when they came to Williamsburg, but in all seriousness, with the logistics part of it, we take that thing for granted, especially looking at it from a modern lens of how easy communication is today. And I mean, the stress that Washington, Rochambeau, and all these guys are under, that hopefully this works, because if not, they're going to be strung out between two ends of the British Army, one in Yorktown and one in New York, and their army may be spread out across the Middle Atlantic colonies. So throw that point out there.
Well, I like that you mentioned the road too. I mean, when you find road traces from that time period is amazing too, because when you also think about it, yeah, Washington decides instead of attacking New York, he's going to go to Virginia. You know, the majority of the guys marched from New York down to Virginia, you know, in the summer and early fall. And it's like, I mean, just trying to imagine what that would have been like, you know, I mean, they're doing like 15 miles a day on a good day. And it's just pretty amazing that, you know, one of my favorite stories about the march, you know, and I think there were some reenactors who actually did a recreation of some of Rochambeau's men who went from Newport, Rhode Island, all the way down to Yorktown.
So did they just pass out the whole way?
Yeah, I know. I remember when I went to William and Mary in Williamsburg, and we had our college company of reenactors. We actually would march along the Colonial Parkway National Park site, so from Williamsburg to Yorktown, to just recreate the last 12 miles or whatever. And that was grueling, and that was just one day of that. So
I think a lot of that route is actually now encompassed by Camp Perry.
Yeah, the actual route. Yeah,
Which is a real shame, because, you know, people like us, like, you know, our sense of place is so important.
Oh, yeah.
And you can get a lot of that on Colonial Parkway. You know, I'm thankful that we have that. And obviously there's so many places that you can visit now in Williamsburg, and then of course in Yorktown proper, to you know, really be in the footsteps
Oh, yeah.
of everybody. But I do wish that we could explore more.
Oh, yeah, or yeah, try and preserve as much, you know. And there is a National Park Service does have the Washington Rochambeau route that tries to link, you know, through trail signs and things like that, all these different sites along the way. And one of the best places is they stop at Mount Vernon to, you know, Rochambeau and Washington stop there, which is Washington's like first time home for 6 years, which is kind of amazing too when you think about how long he would have been away from home. And then once he gets home, you know, it's like planning this siege that they're trying to lay. But yeah, no, the march and the decision to go down there were big decisions. And you're right, you know, we kind of think of everything as just falling in place, and things kind of did fall in place. You know, the French Navy comes up, you know, and it just so happened that de Grasse, like, you know, had the opportunity to do that. And then you have the Battle of the Capes.
Yes.
That goes their way. You know, there were numerous moments where history could have taken a very different turn, but it didn't, and that's how we ended up where we're at today. So it's hard to try and go back and say, well, no, it didn't have to end up this way. So
like moving our timeline along, let's assume that, you know, Cornwallis gets to Yorktown and he's like thrilled to finally be in Yorktown, because he was really sick of being in, you know, Portsmouth, wanted to build a new base of operations in Yorktown. And the thing that I find really fascinating, just again, in terms of how things could have been totally different, and Kirby could probably speak, well, I know Kirby could speak better to this than I, but Cornwallis's decision to just, you know, abandon the majority of his redoubts and fortifications and focus so many men solely on Fusiliers 9 and 10. If he hadn't, I mean, I think that's late September, right? That's really before kind of the siege really gets going proper, like right when Washington is really trying to entrench. And so I think, you know, that decision in and of itself was so pivotal to, you know, that the eventual death knell of Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. And I wonder, had he not have made that decision, how the siege would have progressed and how Washington would have been successful or not, had he not had those focal points.
Well, I think Washington still would have proceeded ahead. I think the Americans and the French would have probably suffered more casualties in the process of trying to take some of those outlying readouts and earthworks. But when we talk about, I'm going to go back to Green Spring for a minute. When we talk about, big things that may have changed this whole process from the time they leave Williamsburg on July 4th to the time that Cornwallis leaves Fort Smith to go up to Yorktown and makes the decision to establish the garrison there. I always go back and take a hard look at Green Spring, because some people say it doesn't matter. Some people say that it does. And kind of playing, the alternate history aspect of it is the way that the fight itself works out at Green Spring. You've got roughly 1,200 men who are there under Lafayette and Wayne. Roughly 800 of them are Pennsylvanians. The other 400 are Virginia militia, and then a small detachment of light infantry and 3 pieces of artillery. Wayne, makes that gamble to proceed with the charge, and then realizing in the process that he's obviously very much outnumbered. But it's kind of what happens after that charge that there's a big question mark that remains out there as far as why didn't Cornwallis pursue Wayne after he left the field. They say it's late in the day. I've gone back and looked at the U.S. Naval Observatory times as far as the sunset data. Some accounts say that the sun was setting between 4 and 5. Obviously, it's summertime. We know that based on living in the area that sets much later, because we're getting there now. So 7:30. So you can't really use the sunset as and dark period of darkness being the excuse to pull Cornwallis's forces off the field. So what really was at play? But I think what may have changed the outcome is if Cornwallis had listened to Tarleton wanted to pursue the remnants of Wayne's forces and the militia that were pulling back to Chickahominy Church. I often think, this is a case of what if Tarleton had been unleashed? What if Cornwallis decided to pursue Lafayette? Would his force been able to have survived that? And if he had destroyed them in the process, or at least gotten rid of a bulk of the Continental Line that's here in Virginia, would he have been bottled up in Yorktown later on? There's no one here to keep him from moving later on, and bottling him up there. Would that have even happened? So I think that's the big what if. That's the big thing that comes out of Green Spring for me, and a lot of other historians when we look at it in depth. But going back to Cornwallis just makes a number of decisions that a lot of people today are still scratching their head on. Why didn't he pursue Lafayette? Why did he pull out of the outer works around Yorktown as soon as Washington shows up? It's always a fun thing to talk about.
Did he hide out in the cave, or?
I think he was busting into the cask of wine in someone's cellar.
That stupid cave. I have been there on class field trips, on college field trips. Kirby, I cannot even imagine how much of your life you have spent trying to talk about Cornwallis's cave there on the beach at Yorktown.
So there's no factual evidence that he was in the cave. I think I was on American Battlefield Trust chat with something like this a few weeks ago, and yeah, that was a debate.
Yeah.
It was invested. But we did have a question real quick, since we're down on the water line.
You gotta go to your pub.
Gotta go to the pub. Okay. Besides going to the pub, did archaeologists actually find the remains of British soldiers or a British soldier along the York River? We had a question from one of the Facebook comments. So just throwing it out there to you three esteemed historians. Does anyone know? Have they found British remains or along the York River back in I think they said the 1970s? Does anyone know anything about that?
I don't know. Or Kirby, maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, so it happened back in the 1970s, and I think again in the 1980s. With some of the nor'easters and hurricanes that come through, they're always taking that top layer down along the beach area there. Now I think we've got so much modern detritus and sand that's brought in. You're not going to find as much right there on the immediate beach. But somewhere close to where the restaurant area is down there in the water now, along the shoreline, they found British remains. They've also found horses, which is part of the the group that Cornwallis has slaughtered early on in the siege to prevent disease and other issues. Obviously, they're running out of feed and water. But that stuff does pop up on the beach from time to time, usually after some of those major storms.
And
Yeah,
I know, also, just archaeologically speaking, too, I mean, recently, too, because there were British in Yorktown, and then there was also some across the York River in Gloucester Point. And me and Kate used to work with Dave and Thane down there in Gloucester, and they
Shout out to the Fairfield Foundation.
yeah, Fairfield Foundation. But they found some artifacts related to the British occupation of that site as well.
Oh, that's right near Vims.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's probably plenty of remnants of that era of history still there, which is kind of
And shipwrecks, obviously, purposeful and otherwise. We are the very lucky custodians to be able to display a lot of artifacts that were recovered from the Betsy, which was a British transport ship, or a British ship used for transport up the York River that was scuttled. And we have got a really, really cool display at Yorktown from artifacts from the Betsy, but there's also the Sharon, just no loss or no shortage of British shipwrecks in the York River. Some have been identified and excavated, and some have not. So lots of work still to do.
Who owns those? Is that state of Virginia or?
Yeah, it's Virginia Department of Historic Resources that own those artifacts.
Very cool.
So we have the artifacts. Should we mention a little bit about the siege? Should we get to the Yorktown siege here? We just moving along a little bit, getting lost in the awesome conversation. But is there any truth to the fact that I mean, Cornwallis doesn't take advantage of the time that he has prior to the arrival of the combined American French forces, correct? So I mean, does that play a part in that he has to be strategic in what he does defend? Is it because of lack of troops? Is it because of disease? It seems that Cornwallis, a great military mind, just is mailing it in half-hearted, thinking putting all his eggs in the proverbial one basket that Clinton's going to come rescue.
Yeah. I think a lot of what you said, Phil, is correct. I mean, I think that Cornwallis is ready to kind of settle in. I think that once once the Continentals arrive, once the Allied forces arrive, I think he knows that it's going to be a long siege. And I think there's evidence that he knows that, and that I think he's trying to hold off a lot until he does see those reinforcements come in. Of course, there's no shortage of kerfuffles with his communication with Clinton. But I mean, he orders his men down to like half rations, right? Kirby and Mark might be able to correct me on that, but I mean, I think he is really worried about food for troops. He's worried about being able to forage. Tarleton and other British regiments are running out and trying to go on foraging parties and things like that, and it's not always successful. They're also meeting with some continental pickets and things that are out there, and they're not always having it's not always peaceful interactions. I mean, there's a lot going on. As Mark mentioned, you do have British and Continental forces on either side of the York River. It's not just Yorktown proper, but there's a lot happening at Gloucester Point, which is a consideration. And disease is huge too. You mentioned that as well. And there's smallpox that's just ravaging through the British Army, and of course, a lot of the casualties of smallpox is really going to be those former slaves, those former enslaved individuals who have chosen to join the British, hopefully, to gain their freedom at the end of the war. And so there's just so much going on that Cornwallis, I just don't think that, to use metaphors, I feel like he's kind of bitten off a little more than he can chew, and doesn't really realize that that where he is can't really sustain all of the problems that he's having, if that makes any sense.
Does anyone want to pick that up? Mark, Kirby?
Yeah, I think so. When we talk about the shortage of food, we talk about the water resources within the town. There is in one of the orderly books with the British regiments, there is a discussion as far as the camp followers and limiting their access to water resources in the town. And I think one of the things that interests me with Cornwallis when he arrives in Virginia in May of 1781, his take on how to handle the population of Virginia is very different than Arnold. You know, when he replaces Arnold in command, Arnold was obviously hated for very obvious reasons. But one of the first things that Cornwallis does is essentially find an excuse to get rid of Arnold, get him out of Virginia, get him away, and try to win back over the population within Virginia that was either partially loyalist and sitting on the fence, but bring that trust back and realizing that he's not going to be as successful if he doesn't have support of the population. So by the time he ends up in Yorktown to begin to see the forces surrounding them, I think they realize that we're kind of past this point of niceties, trying to keep forcing the population on their side, to going out and being a little more forceful with the collection of forage and food for the troops.
And Cornwallis ousts all the civilians, mostly from Yorktown as well, probably, I mean, and using, what resources he can from the civilian populations, then orders all the civilians out. But I can't remember when. That's fairly early on, I think before the Allied forces arrive. Is that right?
Yeah, somewhere around the middle of September, and that's when you see more of the forays on the Gloucester side up that direction. Obviously, you've got the Middle Peninsula, the Northern Neck, those areas. In some cases, they're more of a breadbasket than Williamsburg at this point, and surrounding areas.
Well, poor Williamsburg has been through hell and back,
right?
From 80 and 81. I read recently just a secondary source account of the British Army going through Williamsburg, and the account said the sleepy colonial capital, and I thought, well, that's not right. Williamsburg isn't sleeping. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, by early 81 or by summer 81, how much the landscape has changed for Tidewater, Virginia, for southeastern Virginia.
Yeah, the capital actually was moved, right, from Williamsburg to Richmond.
Yeah, in 1780.
Mm-hmm. And they got burned down.
And then they moved the capital from Williamsburg to Richmond because the British were getting too close, and then the British just take it anyway. So.
But I think there's a lot of I don't think a lot of people realize Richmond was burned during the Revolution, and then also there was in that part of that 81 campaign, there's a battle in Petersburg. Before Spencer's Ordinary and Green Spring, and even going back before that, I mean, there was always kind of like a constant fear that Virginia was most populous, one of the most wealthy colonies before the war, so it was always kind of like on the radar. There's constant fears that the British might show up at any time, and they do some raiding, and there were some small actions early on too. Not to go too far back, but I think people should definitely check out Virginia during the Revolution as far as like Great Bridge, Cricket Hill, which is now over in Gwynn's Island. And they even do a raid in 1781, actually up the Potomac, and go to Mount Vernon, and some of the enslaved people from there go with the British, and it's very touch and go. Almost got burned down by the British as well. So. But there's a lot of Virginia was like constantly in the crosshairs, I feel like.
Yeah, I love that we keep, I know Phil's trying to bring us back to the siege, and we should do that, but I love that we keep going back. Like, no, we got to go back to Green Spring. We got to go back to, to Phillips kicking it after Petersburg. Like, there's so much that has to happen, and that does happen, that makes the siege of Yorktown just uniquely what it is. All of those little things that have to come together, and we keep proving that.
Yeah.
And I'm watching some of the comments on here. I see Jeff Black is on there. He keeps asking about Benjamin Martin, what he did. I suggest you watch The Patriot. You can find that out.
Yeah, let's talk about New Jersey, right? We had a question about actually directed to Kirby and or Miss Kate. And by the way, Miss Kate, you are the fan favorite of multiple people of female historian of the year. So congratulations on historian of the year. But a question about New Jersey Continentals at Yorktown. If anyone knows about them, throwing it out there, I guess, and Mark, if you know as well. I just thought it was Alexander Hamilton and John Laurent and Marquis de Lafayette. There was the three that charged. I didn't realize anyone
That's
else.
really, it was just Hamilton at Yorktown. There was really nobody else there. It was just Hamilton and a couple French guys. What else do you?
I know Benjamin Lincoln showed up near the end because he had to accept the sword. So he came up from Charleston after he got changed. But no, does anyone?
New Jersey regiments at Yorktown is the question.
Let's see. Yeah, check out. Let's see. We got a few different questions. So yeah, one of them was, did anyone talk about New Jersey Continentals at Yorktown?
I'm struggling to think of a good New Jersey anecdote from Yorktown. Anybody?
Get the question stumped.
I know the first and the second New Jersey are there, but I'm struggling to think of names offhand that would be familiar with most folks.
So Dan Casella has stumped the historian. So if anyone knows Dan, yeah. So give Dan a hard time if you know him there. We'll throw another softball question before we start talking military history again. This comes from Rob. What is Kate's favorite artifact in the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown? So when it does reopen, people can go and check out that site.
Artifacts in the museum are like children. You can't have favorites because they're all so unique and different and tell amazing stories. But if you do want to come, and you should come to the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown, we've got a whole section that's just on the Southern Campaign and just the lead up to Yorktown. We used to be the Yorktown Victory Center, and the museum was just Yorktown. And then we realized, well, you can't talk about Yorktown without talking about
everything that came before, right?
Yeah, Camden, Guilford Courthouse, blah, blah, blah. But we also have to talk about the French and Indian War because so we expanded. And now we do it all. So come and visit us when we reopen. But we have a really great section that does just talk about the siege and really unpacks why are you at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown instead of the American Revolution Museum at West Point or at Lower Manhattan. I mean, why did everything culminate to this moment? And really, some of my favorite artifacts in the museum really are those artifacts that were recovered from the Betsy, because some of them are real personal objects that remind us that these are real people fighting a war. There are more than just, I know I just said Hamilton was the only one there, but there's more than Hamilton. There's more than Cornwallis. There's more than Lawrence. There are people whose names we don't know. There are soldiers on board those transport ships that are coming in, and they don't. They're fighting a war that is not on their homeland, not on their turf. There's a really cool whistle in the shape of a monkey. It's a little ceramic monkey, and it's a whistle. And was probably a toy, maybe meant to be a gift for someone's kid back home or something like that. And it was found during the underwater archaeological investigations of the Betsy. And so again, it's not a military object per se, but it's an object of someone's life. And I think that it's really easy for us to get stuck in military minutia and just completely forget that this is someone's life. This is an event that occurred that someone who's a career soldier may be like, well, okay, this is the war and I'm going to go fight. It's a moment in someone's life, a real person like you and me. And I think those small personal objects are really powerful and powerful reminders of the humanity of it all. There are also rat skulls in that same case, because if you're on a ship, you're going to have rats. I like the rat skulls.
There you go. That's rat skulls. So good segue from artifacts and the real people back into a little bit of military history. Tom Sobel asks Kirby, what's your take on Thomas Nelson Jr. urging Washington to fire at his house? Is that fact or myth? We always get a myth busting question in one of these, so here it is.
So from what I know of it, it is a fact. It is one of those things that, remember, Thomas Nelson Jr. is the governor at this point. He's also the head of the Virginia militia. So, a bulk of the forces that are outside of Yorktown under Washington are under his command. This is a guy who has a fair amount of pull. He's also very political behind the scenes. There's some issues between him and Wayne that go back a few months at this point from the time that Wayne comes to Richmond. But Nelson, I think, is looking at, the fact that, he's got his house in town. You've also got the other Nelson house, which unfortunately is no longer standing. That's actually between where the Yorktown Monument is today and the Yorktown Visitor Center with the Park Service. So there's actually an area, it's all bamboo now, where William Nelson's house used to be. But the Nelsons as a whole, I think, were very much caught up in the patriotic fever. And Thomas Nelson Jr. had no issues with using his home as a target. Understanding that it's probably one of the few structures that's still standing, it's fairly significant, a nice brick structure, knowing that Cornwallis would use it as his headquarters or someone of significance within his staff. So I think that is, as far as I know, is a fact. I don't think we were able to bust that while I was working there. But it is interesting to see him offer it up and say, look, this is the level of my dedication to this cause. Aim for my house.
So fact there. I mean, we see it. It pops up. I mean, everyone kind of knows that. Yeah, a little bit about it, but we're glad to finally dispel the fact and myth.
Now, also just on that same thing of firing cannons, Washington, I heard, fired the first shot of the whole siege. Is that true too?
I heard that as well.
No, so the French fire first. But Washington fires the first American gun.
Okay, so that's really good trivia then. So put that's like question 2. It's like the ultimate Yorktown trivia is like who surrendered,
Right,
which we've already answered that. So the trick question number 2 is who fired the first.
Well, who? I wonder who it was. What French was it? Just a common soldier, or was it Rochambeau or somebody? Do we know?
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, okay, huh? Interesting.
Some unknown guy in history has fired the first shot, and somewhere in France, there's a family that has like a little plaque that says he fired the first shot in Yorktown.
Yeah, but it's probably like 50 families in France that say it was our family. It was great so and so. So
I mean,
like,
if we're viral now, if we're internationally viral, maybe there'll be like families lining up in France right now going, it was our family, and we'll get a bigger pool with ERW. But I do a great point here. Someone made land engagements during the Yorktown siege. Are they undershadowed by the naval actions that happen? Are they more important, the naval side of it or the land siege? I know the attacks on Redoubt 9 and 10 pushes forward the eventual capitulation of Cornwallis, speeding it up. But is it really just a matter of time anyway? Because his men are starving, they're running out of military supplies, and because of the squall that picks up on the York River, they can't get across to the Middle Peninsula. So the land engagement side of it. So what's more important? Is there's actions that happen with the Navy, or the actions that happen with, or is it you can't compare? So someone's trying to put us on the spot here in our comments. So I'm putting you guys on the spot.
I don't think you can separate one from the other, because like we keep saying, there's just so much happening just throughout the whole siege with with French ships kind of at the opening of the York. And at one point, Cornwallis sends out ships to, obviously he sends out ships to burn and scuttle, just to prohibit any more French ships from coming in. Washington is concerned, of course, about British ships coming in for reinforcements. I mean, just you cannot, I don't think that you can divorce the naval side from the land side, because I think they both complement each other in complexity, and they complement each other in, in result, really, for lack of a better term. I mean, I just think that you just can't pick one or the other as more important. That's my take on it, at least.
I mean, I agree. You have, even Washington, part of the reason Washington launches attacks, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, there is a real threat that the British may come with their Navy out of New York to come down. And isn't DeGrasse looking to leave? He actually stays longer than he originally planned, and there's that as well. So, I know we always make fun of each other when we take the middle road and don't pick a side or so, but I think this is one of those times when the middle road is actually correct. But we have two more gentlemen on here. See if either one chomps at the bit here.
I think the Navy. Well, I agree with Kate. I think you need both sides, but I also think that the Navy was a factor that was not really in play just a few years before or whatever, and it played such a major role because basically the Royal Navy for the British was, it's a kind of amazing that the French were able to defeat them at the Capes, and without that, the whole story would have played around differently. But I think it's kind of undertold, because there is, as far as that, I don't know. We talked about shipwrecks. I don't know if there's where the exact site the Battle of the Capes happened. What, is there still shipwrecks related to that? Is there, so you don't have that kind of tangible connection to this event that had monumental importance because it happened on the open water or whatever. So.
And to your point too, Mark, the naval battle is really going to continue even after the siege. We all know the siege of Yorktown did not end the American Revolution. There is a whole naval contingent that's going to happen. The Battle of the Saints, as like DeGrasse is trying to just go back to the West Indies, because this whole time I feel like he's like, I have to go. So that's going to continue. Did I just change my own? No, I don't think so. I think I'm sticking with my middle of the road. But you do bring up a great point that maybe it's just incredibly important, but maybe understudied, underappreciated.
Yeah. I think it's definitely underappreciated. But yeah, I think them working in concert, sealed it for.
Sealed the deal, yeah, for sure.
So we've talked about the battle, the campaign. If there's one, since we're like everything, historians, we run out of time because we love to talk about this stuff. If there's one thing from the campaign that people should know, besides that it did not officially end the American Revolution, besides that, what's one thing that's very important, and it can be militarily, politically, from the study of it, material culture, economics. What's one thing that someone should know about the Yorktown campaign or siege? One
thing is hard.
It's like the last call at the bar. Someone says, "Oh, hey, what's one thing I should know?" And you got 5 seconds or a minute to tell them.
Okay. I think the articles of capitulation themselves are probably understudied and appreciated. Because I think there's so much that Cornwallis wants that Washington is not going to give. It really takes, from the time I want to know, not just who fired that first shot, but I want to know who the drummer was that had to, climb up to the top of the hornwork and start beating out, like we surrender and nobody hears it because there's just bombardments happening. I want to know who that kid was. I feel really bad for him. But it takes, what is it, like 2 days from that moment to surrender field. And so much that Cornwallis wants, he wants to walk out with full honors, and Washington is not going to let that happen because nobody let that happen for Lincoln. So there is a lot of things that are personal and that are matters of honor. that really occur right up until the last moment when Cornwallis's men are going to surrender, that I think are really important to just understanding the personalities involved and understanding why things happen the way they do at Yorktown, you know, up until the final moment.
So the surrender is important. Mark or Kirby, I'll go last. That way I can still figure out my answer.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I think one of the interesting things for me is in the process of doing a lot of this research on the individuals that are participating at the Battle of Green Spring under Wayne. You go back and look at just a snapshot of the Pennsylvania line and the officers that are listed at that point in the war with their service, and you go back through their records and you realize that many of these guys have been serving since 1775 or 1776. Some of the officers have been captured at Fort Washington in 1776, ironically by some of the same troops that they're going to be standing there watching march out of Yorktown on October 19th, 1781. So I always think about that, what's that personal connection for them is, you've been a prisoner of war once, you march out of Fort Washington past all these British regiments that now you see on October 19th marching past you. In some cases, these are some of the same men that you saw 5 years prior. And what a feeling of vindication that must have been for the Pennsylvanians, seeing some of these same faces. 17th Regiment of Foot is one of the regiments that captures Fort Washington and one of the regiments that surrenders at Yorktown. So, getting past a lot of the big picture campaign level leadership, logistics, the naval campaign, but getting down to some of the individual stories, for me, I think, is really interesting. Especially when it comes to the surrender. Looking at some of the things that happen post-surrender is also interesting for Yorktown. We always kind of look at the Allied relationship between the French and the Americans as something that's taken for granted. And it may have been after the fact with Washington and some of the other continental leaders. But looking at some of the stories that come out of the lower ranks afterwards, some of the American officers don't understand why are the French going into town and why are they dining with the British officers? Why are they offering up money from French officers to British officers in order to travel home? They just surrendered. Why are we treating them this way? So it's a very emotional time period. And I think the closest that I could get to as far as emotions of the event of the surrender is kind of like the John Adams series, when they signed the Declaration of Independence and no one's out in the street tossing their hats. There's no big celebration. All those men are sitting around trying to think of the impact of what just happened. And I think that's how the surrender was. And I think that you look at it from a personal standpoint, everyone's story is very interesting to me.
Yeah, no, great points there. There's definitely a division or a clarion question, about how the European way of fighting is and surrender and the gentleman thing and what these the American viewpoint is and that divergent and everything, so forth. Also too about we read about kind of like the snubs or whatever of even at the dinner tables or whatever afterwards, where some aren't as welcomed as others. But Mark.
Yeah, now I want to touch on that because one of my favorite anecdotes is afterwards, the story is famous that Cornwallis was ill or feigned illness, so he wasn't at the surrender ceremony, and that he had O'Hara go ahead and surrender his sword in place of him. But Cornwallis does dine with Washington later, and supposedly this was told by his Washington's adopted grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, that Cornwallis raised his glass and said, "Your exploits on the Chesapeake will only be rivaled by those exploits on the Delaware," and was referencing the 1776 and 1777 campaign, where of course Cornwallis faced off Washington there and was victorious. You can read all about that in one of the ERW books.
He works that into every one he's on. He works that in. I don't care what it is. Mark is a way to get it to plug his book.
But
should we put a link?
Yeah.
But anyways, for as far as like the takeaway from Yorktown, obviously the importance of the event. I really like what Kirby's talking about, the humanity, everybody's story. I mean, these stories are all tied to this event because the event had such a huge impact in the history of the country and really the history of the world. You know, yeah, this isn't the final battle of the Revolution, but it's the last major one, at least here in the United States. In fact, when you know, Lord North hears about the surrender in London, he cries out, "Oh God, it is all over." I mean, it had everything on it that basically telegraphed that this was not going to end well for the British in the long run. So basically, the importance of the event, and I would say, in my mind, the most dramatic event of the whole campaign was at Redoubts 9 and 10. And wrote an article about it for Hallowed Ground, the American Battlefield Trust. And you can see it, you know, behind me here, very dramatically painted. It hangs in the Virginia State Capitol today. And that was where, you know, unlike in the painting, it was in the middle of the night, and Washington and American and French troops storm Redoubts 9 and 10 with unloaded muskets, with bayonets, hand-to-hand combat. It was, you know, extremely brutal hand-to-hand combat that ultimately ended in the Americans capturing, you know, some of very famous people involved in this small action, including, you know, Lafayette, Hamilton, Lawrence, you know, all these guys are there, and they're able to capture. And it's, you know, it's been immortalized in the play Hamilton, where they have a whole song about this storming of the Redoubts. But that very dramatic moment, once they capture it, I mean, that's some of the last major hand-to-hand combat. And once they're that close, you know, it's only just a matter of time before Cornwallis has to surrender. And ultimately, the other, and sorry, this is like the third point. The third point is the place, and we kind of talked about that a lot. You know, the place, you know, the fact that most of this land has been preserved by the National Park Service. And maybe Kirby, actually, if you won't mind telling us a little bit about, you know, the battlefield today, because you go out there today and you'll see siege lines, you'll see markers, you'll see Redoubts 9 and 10. I know a lot of these have been redeveloped in like the 1930s. But what like original stuff can you see there? Is there a lot of original earthwork still there, or are they all been improved? I also know there was something, you know, maybe Kate's husband, there's something about a little action that happened nearby there during the Civil War. But
you know, Civil War in too. So.
But you know, what's there today, you know, this part of the National Park Service site that's like original, like what we were talking about, those road traces to be in the actual spot where these guys were? Is much of it still there, or is it mostly gone?
No, unfortunately, so there's only, from the 1781 siege, there's only a small portion of the original earthworks that are left from 1781. And those that are left are portions of the British lines, which were rebuilt. They're actually reused in 1861 as the Confederate forces are moving into the area and building up, using that as part of the defenses for Richmond here in the peninsula. But the Continental lines are almost entirely destroyed the following winter. One of the first things that Washington does after the surrender is puts his men back to work. And that's kind of twofold as to why he does that. The first reason is he realizes that Clinton is still out there, and the word on the street is Clinton is bringing a force down to help rescue Cornwallis, which unfortunately never makes it in time. You know, that's kind of the story that never was. But the fact that Clinton could come down and lay siege to Washington and the French, that possibility was still there. So Washington has his men engaged, tearing down the first and second parallels. They're out there kind of smoothing all that over and then beefing up on top of the British works. And the British works themselves that are around where the Park Service Visitor Center and a portion of the town are, those earthworks in my mind are pretty significant, because you've got the first layer is built by the British in 1781, another layer built by the Americans before they leave that winter, another layer by the French, because the French remain in the area until June of 1782. And then, of course, the 1861-1862 Confederate build on top of that. And then after that, the Union Army comes in, they build on top of that. So you've got essentially 5, almost 6 layers of history just where the British works are. The Continental lines and the French lines, those are mostly destroyed the following winter. And the archaeology with the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s they go out, reestablish where the lines were, and those lines are rebuilt as part of the building the park itself under the CCC projects.
And readouts 9 and 10. I know readout 10 is like, you know, almost on the edge of like about to fall in the water. Is that, you know, is that still like that? And is there any plans to try and shore that up, or is it just kind of like just waiting for erosion to take its way?
Yeah, there's been numerous projects over the years, some of them going back 50 years at this point, to try and shore that up, to try and cement it and keep what remains of it from eroding. I think there's less than a quarter of it, of the earthwork left.
Okay.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
All right, so as we near the end, I'm being caught out by somebody's significant other that have not had enough speaking time or anecdote. So a certain Drew Gruber has called me out and said, what's my favorite anecdote from the campaign or favorite lesser known site? I think he really wants me to talk about a barbecue place that we went to there in Williamsburg. But no, I mean, one of the things that fascinates me is, we touched a little bit upon it, but is the working relationship between Rochambeau and Washington and the lack of a working relationship between Clinton and Cornwallis.
Yes.
And, I mean, it's almost like, I mean, maybe it speaks to more Washington's personality of like, okay, whatever it takes to win, driving his obsession away from New York. But I mean, he's able to drive away from New York, and Clinton can't do it. Clinton holds on to New York, and it takes a longer time to thing. And there's also too is just how their relationship post Yorktown. I mean, Cornwallis goes on to bigger, better, and greater things and revives his career in India and so forth. And Clinton argues about it in his writing his memoirs and everything. And no one wants to talk to Clinton after the American Revolution and so forth. So
Cornwallis throws him under the bus. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve it, because he totally does. But Cornwallis will not accept any responsibility whatsoever for what happened, and writes Clinton like, you know, I did the best with, you know, I did the best I could with what I had, and all of this is your fault. Yeah, he just totally throws Clinton under the bus, and I think everybody buys it. And I think in terms of like the cult of personality, I think Cornwallis is always going to win over Clinton, specifically because of your point, Phil, that he goes back and has a completely new, like, whole second career in India, and is this revered, celebrated, I mean, there are many, many complications here, but you know, a very you know, revered general for the next phase of his career, and Clinton just doesn't just cannot live this.
Just on that point too about Cornwallis's later career too, one of the things he is involved with is the 1798 rebellion in Ireland.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, and you can actually go there. And I remember going to Dublin, and they keep his portrait like slightly lower than everybody else's, because everybody's still
well.
How he
and he
handled.
also goes against what the king a little bit too. He has a little bit of pushback against the British policy, and so
Yes.
he even takes that part. But and then the last thing, I mean, we always talk about what's one book or one place or something you should visit as part of it. One of the things that fascinates me about Yorktown and the importance of it, even though most of it is recreated, there are layers of history there. But if you look at Revolutionary War battlefields that is saved, and where you can still get kind of that idea of what happened, that's one of the better ones out there. I mean, and I know I'm going to get flack from a Vanessa Smiley who's going to talk about Southern Campaign battlefields, but I mean, you look from Virginia northward. I mean, that's one of the most better preserved one of the ones where you still have the semblance of you can get some ideas of what's going on. Another one, I mean, you have like Brandywine, or I know that Mark's going to try to say something about the 10 crucial days. But besides, I mean, Yorktown, it's one of those ones where you can still have the semblance or walk down into town. I think that's what's important, is when you combine the town with the battlefield, and you kind of see both pictures of it. And that's the benefit. And I'll shut up about it right now before I get the homer call that I'm a park ranger. And of course, I'm going to say good things about a national park site. But I mean, that's one of the things. I've been going to Yorktown, Jamestown, Williamsburg since I was 4 or 5 years old. I would say smaller, but maybe people won't believe me with that. But yeah, it's one of the things that I remember going with my dad out to Yorktown and just being able, as I grew up, to see the like, just put yourself in those shoes and on the surrender field or the walk downtown or whatnot. Surprisingly, we never went to Cornwallis's cave, so maybe he knew that was a myth and we stayed to the factual side of things. But just what it meant to be there and that series of plays. So I know we are going over the 8 o'clock hour. We'll continue on for a few more minutes as long as you guys are okay, because I wanted to talk about what's one thing someone should visit or read. We'll throw it up to both of them because to get an idea. Before there is, maybe I heard in the future there will be an ERW book about the Yorktown campaign, but before that comes out, is there a book that you guys would recommend or a place besides the Yorktown Museum, which we should all go visit, that we should visit to learn more about what we talked about this last hour and change? So we'll kick it over to the female, Ms. Gruber, kick us off with this.
Well, of course, I want to say that you should definitely visit us at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. We are on the site. We are not National Park Service property, but our museum, you can find us pretty close to the visitor center there. But we are located actually right across the street from the Fusiliers readout, right off of Colonial Parkway. So definitely come and visit us. There's also an article that I wanted to mention by a woman named Catherine Carrison that you could probably find on JSTOR called By the Book. And it actually talks a little bit about what, this is kind of tangential, but the article talks a lot about how the French presence, the officers' presence in and around the Williamsburg area in 1781, 1782 starts to impact some of the young women in town. And I wanted to bring this up because we did mention that a lot of civilians were actually ordered out of town by Cornwallis, but there are still a lot of civilian implications for for the town of Williamsburg and for a lot of the residents there. So I wanted to offer that up as an interesting, if not slightly smutty way to examine the impacts of a certain son of a certain French officer in and around the greater Yorktown area. I'll leave it at that.
Kirby, take us from there.
Obviously, I'm going to make a plug for Jamestown. So if you get the opportunity to visit historic Jamestown, there's a lot of work going on out there. The archaeology that's been done on Jamestown Island and some of the surrounding sites the last few years have turned up Revolutionary War period artifacts. So I know there's been some USA buttons, some French regimental buttons in the area. There's the Royal DuPont French regiment is garrisoned in the area after the Yorktown siege. Go visit the Green Spring battlefield. The nice thing is most of the core of the battlefield itself is actually under some sort of conservation easements and protections. So you can actually walk the Virginia Capitol Trail that starts in the parking lot there at Jamestown Settlement. Walk from there. You can walk across Jamestown Road, follow that Capitol Trail. It's about 500 yards of walking on a nice small paved path. We'll take you out to the core of the Green Spring battlefield. And then if you plan on doing that, following up on some of the movements of Cornwallis and Lafayette, the Crown forces prior to the Yorktown campaign itself, I would recommend the Road to Yorktown by John Moss. It's a great book. John did an excellent job going back, and he did a lot of fact versus myth in the process of his research, and was able to trace the routes that both armies used throughout Virginia from the time that Lafayette arrives in April of 1781, crossing from Maryland. Cornwallis arriving with his forces from the Carolinas. A lot of the smaller actions, but there is that buildup. So the thing I like about the book is it really does spell out those movements and kind of hints at some of the small mistakes here and there and the little chips and chinks in the Cornwallis's armor leading up to Yorktown. So when we talk about Spencer's Ordinary on June 26, 1781, the Queen's Rangers, that's kind of a big hit for them. They're not really combat effective in the sense that they would have been prior to that engagement. By the time Yorktown rolls around, not many of the Queen's Rangers are left at that point to operate on their own. the Battle of Green Spring itself. Just so many small actions that lead up to the Yorktown campaign later on. But I would recommend visiting Jamestown, both sites, the island and the Jamestown settlement. There is that Revolutionary connection there. And Jamestown, of course, because it's the beginning and the end of the British influence in Virginia. They lose their last seat with the House of Delegates in 1776.
Yeah. So Mark.
Yeah, no, I talked about a lot of the different sites that are associated with a couple of the ones we mentioned a little bit about Gloucester. I think it's kind of cool. There's a little spot, today it's I think there's a Burger King on the site, but there's a little marker there to note where the Battle of the Hook happened, which was one location where Tarleton and some of the British tried to break out and were turned back. So there's just that whole area, there's stuff all over the place. One other thing we didn't mention is the Victory Monument. So Congress, said that there should be a monument to mark this momentous occasion. It took, I think, like 100 years for them to finally actually build it, but it's still kind of cool. And I see Mike Cesare is watching us online here, and I do reenactments with the 7th Virginia, and we've done some living histories there at the monument on 4th of July, and listening to the words of the 4th of July in the shadow of this monument marking this momentous event is always very moving. So I definitely check out. That's right there in town. If you're at downtown Yorktown, like I said, go down to the cave. You can check that out, whether you want to believe it or not. And then you can also go to the Yorktown pub, which is great for getting some brews and some burgers. So.
Now I'll mention, across in Gloucester, there is a little part of the earthworks, I think, that was improved upon, of course, in the Civil War, right as you get across the bridge there to the left. There's also right outside of Gloucester, one of the parks I used to work at, George Washington birthplace, National Monument. It was Washington's grandfather, I think, got married, Lawrence Washington, got married down outside Gloucester to a family there. So
the whole if you wanted to. So.
There it is. So just a little, Washington, but Colonial Williamsburg, the historic Triangle, these small little sites. You can definitely spend a lot of time there. Great bookstore. Since no one mentioned it, we can, what is it? The Guns of Independence. If you want a general overview, history, Jerome Green there as well. We will put the names of these books and we'll get the title from that essay, if you don't mind, Ms. Gruber, someone asked in the comments. Before we do end though, next week we are talking about taverns. We will bring back someone that was on one of the first Facebook or ERW Rebel Revelries. We also got a great suggestion from one of our top fans, Tom Sobel, who said that we should do an ERW drinking game basically because of Mark. If Mark brings in Trent and Princeton, or talks about the Civil War, or brings in Hamilton, you should take a drink.
So should we cheers to all of those right now?
I finished because of Mark already, but so all the people watching online, to Kate, to Kirby, Mark, thank you for enlightening us. It's been great. I've learned a lot from studying the weather to Green Spring, Spencer's Ordinary, to Rat Skulls. We've had a little bit of all, so thank you all for watching. Please come back next Sunday to have a tavern talk about taverns and their importance in the revolutionary movement. But thank you again for turning in the Rebel Revelry, and have a good night, everyone.
Thanks for having me.